Hey everyone. So I was reviewing this merge request this morning. It's a GitLab UI related one where we're upgrading or migrating an old Dropdown component to the new Dropdown component. And notice that we had some failing pipelines. So I'll go ahead and open these up one by one from scratch. And I basically thought it would be a really good opportunity to go through some of these tests that are failing, because see these fairly often when reviewing GitLab UI related merge requests. So we can see here that we've got like a failing test here, which is failing on toMap snapshot. So something's going on with snapshots. And then we've also got, looks like a particular label isn't being found, or the event isn't firing properly or something. But that's okay. We don't really need to know exactly what's happening now, but let's go ahead and jump into the code. So first, I've already had a look at the changes in this MR, and they all look really good. But the thing that kind of sticks out to me is that, you know, we're changing the actual template of this component, which means that because we've got some failing tests, there's probably some areas of the test that need to be updated for these changes that have happened to the template. So go ahead and open up VS Code, and I will go back to the failing pipeline and figure out what file we need, which is this labels selector spec. And back to VS Code and find that file. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and run this file locally to check that we get those same errors. I've got a good VS Code extension called Jest Runner. And basically what that allows me to do is just right-click this file and then simply click Run Jest File, which will just generate that command that you see there, which will run the test for this, all the tests for this file. And we see that we're getting those same failures regarding the snapshots. So why the snapshots are failing is because previously, when this test was written, we've generated a snapshot of what this component actually, what the markup of this component actually looks like. And then because we've now in this MR gone and changed some things in the template, the snapshot hasn't been updated, and so the test has failed because the components look different. The markup looks different. So just looking at the differences here, it's pretty clear to me that there's no real major changes besides the fact that previously the snapshot had this GL deprecated dropdown, and now we're just using the new version of this dropdown. So it's probably safe to use the -u option. So if we run Jest on this file with the -u option, it'll regenerate the snapshots for us based on the changes that we've made. And so it's sometimes a little bit unsafe to do this, but I think in this case it's totally fine. So now if we head over to the changes, so now the snapshot's been rewritten, and you can see in my git diff here, we've got it's been updated to match the changes that have been made to this template. And so if we look at the tests, we've still got 3 failing, but I think before we had 5 failing. So cool, we've solved 2 of our problems, which is a good start. All right, so this next one, let's have a look. So one thing, I haven't actually looked at these tests yet. I'm trying to do this totally blind. Okay, so we find a drop-down item, we're finding a particular one, and then we click it. Okay, so what I might do is head back to GitLab. And I'll go back to the changes for this merge request. Just have a look. Looking for things that have changed regarding the drop-down item, and I think I see one. So it looks like here in this bit of code here, what is it, line 145. We previously had a drop-down item, and now that's been updated to a drop-down section header. And that probably makes sense because it's got selector label here, so it's some kind of heading. That probably makes sense. But what that signals to me is that when we're finding all these drop-down items, we're getting like the total list of drop-down items that are being rendered, and then we're selecting the third one, or the second element of the item at index 2 of the list. There's probably one less item in there because we've gotten rid of this one and we've changed it to a section section header. So I wonder, find all drop down, and then maybe let's just change that to 1, and let's run this test. So the other cool thing that we can do with that jest runner extension is we can right click on the specific test like string here that we want to run, and then just simply click run jest, and that'll generate the command specifically for this test. And sweet, it's parsing. So that was a good assumption, very, very lucky assumption. The other thing to point out here is that we're selecting based on a class, which is less than ideal sometimes. But it looks like that's probably okay because we need to do a full mount and not a shallow mount. Won't go into that in this video, but we need to do a full mount so we can trigger this click event. So that probably makes sense. Anyway, let's run the whole set of tests again and then see what other tests we need to fix. So we should be getting only 2 failures now, which we do. We're going to get 2 failures. So 3 down, 1 to go. I reckon they're probably all similar things. So no item exists at index 0. Let's have a look at this one. So generally, if a test, if it spits out this kind of code for this test, I'll generally just search it, and I'll be able to find the spot. Okay, so it looks like we're using this find active item somewhere in these tests. So what's this one doing? We'll render with the default option selected. Okay, so this test here seems to be wanting to check that we're rendering this selector label item. And luckily, I remember that we've changed, in this MR, we've changed this deprecated dropdown item to a dropdown section header. And this is the one with the select a label in it, select a label text in it. So basically that means that we're selecting an active item here, but it's not the one we want because we now want to select for this, GL dropdown section header. So let's try that. So what we can do is firstly, I'll probably have to do that up here. We can import the GL drop down section header. Is that it? Let's just check that that's the right one. GL drop down section header. Can import that from @GitLab UI. And now that we've got that, we can find that test, which is here. And so we're selecting the section header now. So we'll just rename that variable. And I want to find that section header component in our wrapper component that's been rendered. So I go wrapper.find and then just pass in that component directly. Make sure these variables are updated. I wonder if this will work. So run test. Sweet, looked like it worked as well. So let's run the whole file again. Should only have one more failing test to fix now. Sweet. All right, let's fix this one. So wrapper emitted clear label to be true. So that would be this one here. We'll emit a clear label event if it is at the default item. Okay. If it is the default item. Okay. Let's go back to the diff and see if we can find any clues. Okay, so there's that clear label event. Okay, so I'm guessing, this is a guess, we could go ahead and test this. I'm guessing what previously happened before is that we had this selector label element on the page. That was actually a drop-down item. And then once it was clicked, it would clear the labels. And so I'm guessing that's probably not what we want anymore because we've got this drop-down section header. So I'm gonna assume, and I mean, if this was me actually doing this, I'd probably go ahead and test locally whether that was actually the case. So whether if we highlighted over this item and then clicked it, it would clear the label selection. But I'm guessing we can probably get rid of that actually, because this is meant to be acting more as a header. And I mean, let's look at the screenshots. Select labels, select labels. Okay, so there must be another case. Must be another screenshot that we're missing here for this selector label section header. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that we don't even need that test anymore. So let's just remove that because we're not going to be selecting. We're not going to be worrying about the case when the user wants to clear their labels. Should probably have like an X button, or I don't know what the pajamas recommended way of doing that is. Probably a clear label button or something. So the other thing we'll need to do is find that component and remove these. So we're not going to worry about this active state on this drop-down section header anymore. And I mean, to check, to triple check, we can always go to Storybook, and drop-down section header. I mean, it looks like we don't even have any props on this component, which probably makes sense. We could double check in the GitLab UI code base itself, but I think it's fair to assume that we don't even have any props for this component anymore. So let's just go ahead and wipe these. Cool. And I mean, this is obviously going to pass now. So let's just double check. Now, of course, we've got failing snapshots because we've removed some attributes on, what was it? On the section header. So we can go ahead and do a little trick of -u. And this will regenerate the snapshots for us, and everything's passing. Love it. So yeah, probably wouldn't generally recommend just removing tests. That's definitely not best practice. But I think in this case, because we're actually removing functionality from this component, so we're removing the ability for someone to click remove label, click the heading to clear the labels because we're removing that functionality. I think it's totally fine to remove the test for that because we no longer have to test for that functionality. Cool. So it's looking good. let's head back to the pipeline and check that we don't have any more. So this pipeline looks like it was all failing on this label selector spec, which we've fixed. So let's now head to this second one. Okay, so this one's now, so we're now concerned with this custom stage form spec. And it looks like similar issues, like some label IDs mismatching when some events. So we'll set the start event label ID when field is selected. So I think probably that will be a similar issue to what we just fixed. So we'll go ahead and open up that spec file. And we'll just run the file locally, see that we get the same errors. So right click, run just file. Cool, and we get those two failing specs. So again, let's go ahead and find that test. Yeah, okay, so item at index 0 is select a label. That's not the case anymore because that select a label item is no longer an item, it's now a section header. So because that's not there, we've got one less item in the list, so let's give it a go at index 0 instead of index 1. And I mean, we can probably just try to do that for the other failing spec as well. Yeah, same thing. Item in index 0 is select a label. That'll be 1, just 1 less than 2. Go ahead and run the file. Nice, perfect. Okay, so we've now fixed those two specs. So I wonder if that's it. Let's go back to the pipelines. Check this failing one. So we've solved this one, we've solved this one. Okay, so it looks like we've got an RSpec one to solve now. All right, let's have a look. Customizable cycle analytics spec. Oops, not Spotify, VS Code. And the one that was failing, just copy and paste that message. Search for it in our file. And it's this one. Okay, that looks interesting. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes with these RSpec ones, like the test has failed, but it's some exceptions been thrown earlier, which has caused the whole thing to fail. So as you can see here, this looks a bit more interesting. Undefined method click for this nil object. Okay, so it's doing a similar thing to what we just saw, except in Ruby. So let's go ahead and search for this code. Yeah, cool. So select dropdown level. It's still assuming that we want everything at an index that's 1 too many now because we've removed that. We've always got 1 less dropdown item now. So I mean, let's just go ahead and try it. Index 1. Now let's figure out where this function is actually used. Yeah, we'll just decrease all these by 1 as well. Cool. Now to run this, we go and copy the relative path and go bin/rspec in my GitLab directory. And this could take a while. Okay, so that's okay. Just the test pass, it's all good. So yeah, that's looking really good now. So I think we've fixed all these tests. Yeah, regarding removing that test, I'm going to make a comment here in this merge request. Where are we? I'm going to make a comment. I'm going to make a comment here where we've changed this drop-down item to a section header saying, did we want to remove this functionality, or do we want to give the user a different option for clearing the labels here? But if that was confirmed, then removing that test and removing these attributes here is a totally satisfactory approach, I'd say. Yeah, hope this video was useful.